I'm the Engagement Director at the World Benchmarking Alliance, and we're proud to host this C20 session. The WBA is a not-for-profit. We've been around for just over 2 years, and we're creating a movement to incentivize business to meet the UN SDGs. If we allow ourselves to go back to the beginning of the year, I believe I speak for many that we all had a joint ambition to kickstart the decade of delivery for action with the required shift from commitments to tangible policy actions and implementation. We knew then that we had some serious work to do: a slowing global economy, stalling poverty rates, climate risks being more pressing than ever, and inequalities remaining broad within and among countries, including gender and racial inequality. And then fast forward back to today. The last 9 months have changed our societies and way of life completely. The continuing COVID crisis is resulting in a health, humanitarian, economic and development crisis of proportions that few of us could have ever imagined. We therefore have an even greater need to find bolder, more transformative approaches to tackling these interrelated challenges. And we also have an ever more pressing need to collaborate and find actions that cross stakeholders, borders, and defy our normal systems. So I'm really delighted with the panel that we have today. Our speakers have different backgrounds, geographies, and are cross-sector. We're looking at how we can make transparency in the form of corporate disclosure of impact, encourage accountability of and leadership in companies. The private sector is pivotal in helping us achieve what the UN Secretary General talked about a few weeks ago of inclusive multilateralism. And our panel, focused on corporate action, fits into the C20 summit track devoted to accountability and transparency. So we really hope that this conversation contributes to the way in which we can together achieve this inclusive multilateralism. And of course, governments also play a key role. It's no surprise that calls around transparency so far have been in respect of governments and public authorities and the role they play in ensuring a fair response to the crisis. But we do need to look forward stronger, and we do need to hear different perspectives. And I hope you agree with me that it's not enough that government speaks to government, business speaks to business, and civil society speaks to civil society. This would be way too comfortable, and it is certainly not the inclusive multilateralism that the Secretary General asks of all of us. So our speakers today are not from the G20, but they are from the world of business or those organizations working closely with business. We need the business community to lead, and critically, we need civil society, gathered here today as the C20, to contribute to guiding them. So I would really ask you to keep that in mind for our Q&A session today. Before I kick off with the panel, I have a few housekeeping notes. This event is recorded and is considered on the record. Importantly, and this is really dear to all of us, we really want to hear from our audience. So please put your questions and comments in the live chat stream so that we can then guide our panelists to addressing them. So wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is, get involved in our conversation. And that's it from me. Let's get going, and let me turn to our first speaker. Gerbrand, you're the Executive Director of the World Benchmarking Alliance, and you're leading a movement to incentivize corporate action on the SDGs. What does it mean for you to create a movement for change? And can you tell us about the SDG 2000 and how you're working with companies in adopting a systems level approach and good corporate disclosure?
Thank you, Paulina, and thank you to my fellow panelists for joining me in what we believe is a really important conversation. Paulina took us back to the early 2000s, to the beginning of this year, which seems like a century ago because of COVID. And for some, that means inconvenience of working from home. For many people on this call, that's about as far as it goes, but it means hunger for a lot of other people. So COVID has really really extravagated a lot of these global inequalities that we've seen, both between countries and within countries. And so because it was a health crisis and quickly translating into an economic crisis, the response from the G20, of course, has been predominantly on health and on debt relief. And while that was, of course, adequate in terms of and appropriate in terms of the urgency, as we now start to think about how we emerge from this crisis and how we build back better, or how we do it even completely different, we have to think about different things beyond debt relief and health. And to us, it means we really have to focus and go back to where we actually started the year, which was supposed to be a decade of action on the SDGs. And what we have, where we as the World Benchmark Alliance come in, is that we have tried to translate the UN Sustainable Development Goals back to the system transformations that need to take place for these goals to be achieved. So it means, in very practical terms, we need a decarbonization of our energy system. We need a transformation of our food system. We need a transformation of our digital system. We still have 3 billion people that do not use the internet. Now, that was a problem before COVID, but it only became a bigger problem after COVID. There's just no way you can participate in today's economy if you're not connected. But it also requires, and I suspect some of our talking today, it also requires a transformation of the financial system in the way that it stewards all these other parts of the economy. Now, what we have been doing as the World Benchmark Alliance is not only make this transformation to this translation from the SDGs to the transformations, but then look at what are the industries within those transformations with the biggest impact. So if we stick to finance, we talk about asset managers, we talk about asset owners, we talk about banks, insurance companies. These are really the industries that define those transformations. And we could do the same for the food system, where we look at both the input companies that provide seeds and fertilizer farmers, all the way to out of home, and think about companies like McDonald's and also retailers. Now, what we have tried to do is sort of to see what are within those industries the most influential companies. What are the ones that are actually defining how these industries operate? And that is a term we call Keystone Companies. So those with a disproportionate influence on their industry and therefore on their system. And that resulted in a list that we launched last year during Davos of 2,000 companies that we've called the SDG 2000. And these 2,000 companies represent about half of the global economy in terms of their revenue. And to that extent, they have a massive impact on all of these transformations and therefore on the SDGs. So if we can't move those companies, the world will not move. And it's helpful to remember for today's discussion that about 90% of those 2,000 companies are headquartered in the G20. So it really brings it down to 20 countries in the world that have the key to making sure that we move the private sector in the right direction. And that is going to require what we believe a lot of more transparency about what the actual impact is of companies. And that is going to require a whole ecosystem of organizations to work together to define what we expect as a society and from science expect companies to disclose on. And it's going to require an even bigger audience of organizations to then take that data and take that insight and engage with companies on where they need to improve. And so together we then provide the incentives for companies to step up and create accountability mechanisms for those companies that are going to lag behind. And I think that's why this panel to me is so important, because we have with Clara and Sonel, we have some of these organizations that are really working on the metric side of things, on aligning global expectations towards business. With CIMA, we have, I think, a representation of business, which is going to be absolutely key for business to adopt this and for business to be part of these conversations, to actually articulate where their role is and where they can contribute. And it will going to take big financial institutions like 91 and the many others that make up which make up the 400 most influential financial institutions in the world, to use that data and allow it to guide their investments and guide their engagement with companies to make sure that we steer us all collectively in the right direction. And not on this panel, but a lot of this, and I think in the audience today, a lot of what we expect as society is actually translated through civil society. So the way that we manage to bring in civil society in those conversations in terms of outlining what their expectations is, and they can go as far and wide as about what we need from a climate change perspective, all the way to what we need down in the supply chains of garment manufacturers when we talk about the role of women. So bringing all of these parties together, as Paulina sort of outlined, is partly what we believe is the key to building this movement and what we think is needed to create these systemic changes. I look forward to this panel. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you. There's a lot to unpick there, but you've already really nicely set out the task for our panelists. So Clara and Sonal thinking about the standards and the metrics, how we bring all of that together globally to provide the accountability, and CIMA in how companies are embracing the new kind of reporting and the new kind of transparency. And then Hendrik, how we're using them and creating that action and creating the progress. So I'm now going to turn to our four panelists to really think about all of that in more detail. And our first theme is focused around identifying gaps and best practice in transparency aligned with the SDGs, and reflecting, of course, this year on the added complications that COVID has placed on all of us. So Clara, maybe I can start with you. You're the CEO of the Impact Management Project, a brilliant and really ambitious initiative drawing together a globally consistent framework for managing and measuring impact. From your point of view, where are we now in terms of companies and investors understanding how their decisions align with the SDGs? And where are we on measuring and managing impact?
Thank you so much, Paulina. And as the IMP is a facilitation team, so we have the benefit of speaking to so many stakeholders in that role. And starting at the very macro level, I just want to talk about two really important theories of change that are going on, that measurement is serving. And then I briefly want to talk about why I think now is a pivotal moment for progress, and then just close with some reflections on the future and some really important developments that are already underway but need to accelerate, specifically vis-a-vis understanding progress toward the SDGs. So the first observation is, I said two theories of change. What we're witnessing is that there is a theory of change which is about all kinds of different stakeholders understanding companies' significant impacts on people, planet, and economy, and then responding in different ways. Some of those stakeholders might be activist organizations that are using it to hold companies accountable. Some of the organizations might be policymakers who are using it to create incentives to reward companies that are serving the SDGs more than others, or to penalize those that aren't. So there's a variety of different consumers are actually another important one to mention, of course, increasingly consumer interest in this area. You've got the broad range of stakeholders with differing but related objectives who are using the information that is measured by companies. But at the same time, you have another theory of change that's running alongside that, which is the capital market perspective, and the theory of change that the investment community has. And that theory of change is rooted actually in resilient capital markets, in enterprise value creation, and how investors can protect investments. It's the domain of the securities regulators. And what we're witnessing at the moment is both of those theories of change requiring measurement, because the capital markets, the accounting side of the world is very much aware now of the fact that the data that is produced through measurement of how companies are impacting the world in turn leads to a better understanding of risks and opportunities, and therefore information that is as material for understanding long-term financial performance as the sort of information you expect to see in the financial accounts of a company. And that investors need that broader set of information as well. So those two theories of change are really important, and we need to be running with both, is an observation I would make. The second thing is just to say that it is a pivotal moment now, because those two theories of change are no longer just a voluntary one. In the last 12 months, we've seen extraordinary interest from regulators come through. So you already had the theory of change of the capital market I was describing. There was already an expression of interest in that area. The success of the TCFD that came out looking at climate-related disclosure for the financial community has had enormous uptake. So that interest was already there. But what's happened in the last 12 months is you've seen the securities regulators become more explicitly involved. So a series of reports and then statements by IOSCO from the securities regulator perspective, saying how important measurement is going to be for the resilience of financial markets. And then the European Commission at the same time, from the European perspective, has been extremely helpful at talking about, in effect, the two theories of change I just described. They use a framing double materiality, talking about the fact that we need both of these lenses, and committing to put regulation behind that, and launching a task force, which is now underway, looking at recommendations for how that might look. So I wanted to mention that because that level of regulatory interest could be a significant shaper of the measurement scene. And I'm really pleased at the pace at which the conversations seem to be unfolding. The final piece I'm going to talk about, recognizing that Sonal will go into much of the detail here, is just the kind of frontier work in this area, and where are things going in terms of really understanding progress against the SDGs. And I actually think, Herbrand introduced the scope of the World Benchmarking Alliance. I think this idea of really understanding the system drivers of the SDGs and then having public benchmarks, not benchmarks that sit behind a paywall that are inaccessible to most people, but open benchmarks that look at companies' performance against those system drivers is an incredibly important piece of the puzzle. Another one, I think, is actually at the individual company level, which is, we talk about measurement a lot and people think metrics, and that's absolutely right. It's the bedrock. You need a framework to determine, well, what impacts am I meant to be reporting on? And then you need the metrics to disclose comparably wherever possible. But the interpretation piece is increasingly important if we really want to drive progress against the SDGs. And what I mean by that is that when you look at performance on a metric, whether it's GHG emissions or it's looking at workplace-related injuries, through to, you know, a healthcare or an educational product and the outcomes that that is driving, you actually don't know whether that performance is positive or negative, whether it's good enough, unless you have these additional reference points to take into account. And an example of an additional reference point is what we'd call a social or ecological threshold. So with carbon emissions, what is the threshold for what is considered okay in terms of an individual company and industry, and then looking at that at the global level? If you're talking about water withdrawal, you have to look at the local context. Am I in an area of water scarcity? Am I not? Those contextual factors you require in order to understand whether things are positive, negative, good enough, vis-a-vis the SDGs. And as we start to bring in country need data that can also show whether the changes that are being delivered, those impacts are actually reaching populations that would otherwise be left behind, and you bring all of that together with the metrics, you start to get to, I think, an incredibly promising set of information that can help drive progress. So as I said, I will leave Sonal to add in more of the detail, but I'm pretty optimistic by how things are shaping up right now.
Thank you so much, Clara. And that's one of the most eloquent ways I've heard double materiality being described. It's often a very technical conversation, so you've brought it really alive for people, and so thank you for that. And you also teed up Sonal really well, and so I'm going to come to you next. Sonal, you're the Director of Civil Society and NGO Outreach at SASB, the Sustainability Accounting and Standards Board. And as Clara already said, you've been working closely with her and her team at the IMP. What are you hearing from business on sustainability standards? Where's it going? How much ambition is there to continue to build back better, or what we're starting to call actually build forward stronger? Where's the kind of, what are you hearing, and where does civil society play in this regard as well?
Thank you for having me, and thank you for your question. And thanks, Clara, for taking me up. You know, I think more than ever, companies and investors recognize the critical value sustainability standards provide, particularly in gathering critical information on issues such as inequality, labor practices, especially for gig economy and essential workers, and wages, because this information underpins resilient and efficient markets. It helps investors make better decisions about where to allocate capital for sustainability enterprises and projects. And when that's combined with companies' disclosure of all significant impacts on sustainable development, it helps us accelerate progress on the SDGs. So transparency and accountability on sustainability issues is a fundamental part of effective business management. At SASB, we believe managing these issues over the long term is likely to improve business performance in the form of reduced operating costs, enhanced reputation, greater resilience to risks such as pandemics, and the potential for competitive advantage. So when you ask me about building back better, what I'm saying is that the fundamentals for to reduce their negative impacts and increase their positive impacts on these issues, well, that's not changed. What the pandemic has brought is a new light into the urgency of managing these issues at scale. And that's really critically important. And, you know, where civil society can play an important role, that's in helping to illuminate these issues further. You know, we really recognize that civil society organizations have the knowledge and expertise on these issues, both localized and global, particularly human rights, supply chain sourcing, and building those connections to feed into standards will be critical.
Thank you. Sorry, I was writing down very much what you were saying. Lost my train of thought. Thank you, Sonal. I want to turn to, so we've heard about the the interpretation piece and civil society having a view of what companies should be doing and playing a very key role in that interpretation piece. Seema, let me come to you in thinking about how companies are responding to these expectations and to the way in which they're being asked to provide greater transparency. What are you seeing in terms of the business response in India?
Hi, good evening to everybody, and it's a pleasure to be a part of this very interesting and panel discussion. And already I'm learning so much from my co-panelists. So coming to your, question, Paulina, I think in India, pretty much we are seeing the large companies responding quite positively to these demands of more transparency and disclosures, essentially for the reasons that were already mentioned. But I think most of them start more from an internal point of view. All kinds of these frameworks and reporting matrices and indicators help companies understand where they're going and help them make more competitive and more efficient. So it starts with all of that I as a company want to make sure that I'm taking care of my resources well. I'm on the path to becoming a more competitive company. On top of it, we are seeing a growing evolution of the requirements of non-financial disclosures in India. In fact, we are seeing that coming from the stock exchange. We are seeing that coming from for companies who want to seek funds from overseas. So the investors there are asking all of that. To just give you a little idea of how it has been, panning out, the way this has been, evolving in India. It started in early 2000 actually. So we're talking of almost a 15-year or a 20-year period where, corporate governance was made a listed requirement. So including a corporate governance report as a part of the, annual report was made by the stock security, SEBI in India, mandatory. Then basically almost 2012, business responsibility reporting was made mandatory for top 100 listed companies. So that's a requirement by, again, the stock exchange, the Securities Exchange Board, saying that, you must talk about beyond financial reporting, and there's a listing of what they need to talk about. It covers all ESG parameters. Similarly, 2016, this was extended from 100 to 500. And in 2017, SEBI actually put out a recommendation encouraging top 500 companies to adopt integrated reporting. And it is voluntary, but we are seeing a huge uptake from companies. We started, let's say, with 3 companies in 2015, and this financial year, probably we'll have over 50 companies, doing integrated reporting. And these are all the top companies, as was mentioned, that they're really the ones which probably come in the top 200 companies as well. So we are really seeing a evolution of, requirements, and companies are responding well. This whole concept of materiality, of course, has come in through the GRI movement in the country, but now companies are, taking it beyond just GRI, going into integrated thinking. And there's demand also, as was mentioned, from the regulators, but also in some cases by the buyers. So if you are in the global value chain, we can see that companies are being asked to provide this information. A lot of companies come to CII and we provide them hand-holding for some of these things. And they are, really wanting to know that if I have such a, score on some of these ratings, how do I improve my score? What are the gaps? So we see a very positive response from companies at the moment. And I only see this growing in future. I also want to just add one perspective that how COVID has actually, changed all of this. What we are hearing from, so of course, huge disruption, as you know, and everybody has sit up and is now, reviewing that if COVID was such a disruption, what are the other risks that we have? And we are getting to hear from boards of companies now that tell us that what kind of disruption could climate cause? And therefore, what should we do to actually be ready? So I think this again is I would say an opportunity to push for more transparency, more disclosure, because at this time, companies are actually ready to look at these large systemic disruptions and also prepare themselves. And I think that gives us an opportunity to also talk to them and bring in certain, more understanding of how, if they are more transparent, they would have lesser risks actually. So I think this is an interesting, I would say, a point of time where we can take the conversation forward the next step. These would be my initial thoughts. Thank you, Pauline.
Thank you so much. And you anticipated that actually I had a follow-up question on terms of what is the COVID crisis? How is that changing, if anything? So thank you for that. And I'd like to maybe in the Q&A take that a bit further with you, Seema. And you are speaking as the Deputy Director General of the Confederation of Indian Industry. My apologies, I should have said that before you started speaking. I'd now love to bring in our next speaker and our investor voice. So Hendrik du Toit is the CEO of the global asset manager 91. Hendrik's a really great example of a business leader who is leading with purpose and focuses on the long term. So like to hear your views on that. But before we look at your company culture, Hendrik, maybe with the COVID-19 crisis, there's a concern that some companies and investors might use this as a vehicle to backtrack on sustainability and investments aligned to the SDGs. Is that right? Is that a concern that we should all be taking a stock of, or what's your experience actually from working with clients and in this regard?
Thank you, Paulina, and thank you for the other panelists for their interesting contributions. It's a great privilege to be with you to talk about this important topic, which we all have in common. My answer to you, Paulina, in terms of, essentially you saying, did companies or did business take the gap and avoid doing the things they should be doing as decent and good corporate citizens? I would say actually the opposite happened in the business world. In the world of government, it started because of the massive financial pressures, and I guess to an extent I didn't want to use this word publicly, but I think the rich world has been pretty inward focused and probably quite selfish about handling of this crisis, because it was all about domestic electorates rather than dealing with the world at large. And we've seen the absolutely huge lack of leadership that's come from the global hegemon. Individuals will not be mentioned here, but we all know what we're talking about here. There hasn't been global leadership at political level of the kind we required here, and definitely not at the level that we saw after the global financial crisis about 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago. So actually it's already 12 years ago. But as far as business is concerned, and as far as the financial world is concerned, the one trend that's accelerated is the sustainability trend and the requirements in supply chain for more sustainability, more accountability, better communication about what you do. And indeed, if I can boil it down or go down to our industry, the asset management industry, the investment industry, we have never seen as much demand for high quality, sustainable investment product, or at least all product meeting certain standards. The conversation has been accelerated a bit like digitization has been accelerated in whether it's manufacturing or business in general, or the way we live. So I would say COVID has helped sharpen our minds. Where we are falling behind is actually setting the rules. And also when you talk to companies, if it was 20 years ago, you would have people argue that the role of business is only, was it Milton Friedman who said in the 80s, the business of business is business. Actually, that has moved on. People understand and have accepted sensible stakeholderism or stakeholder thinking. We don't always have the answers. And I think the area where many of you can help us, and many of the people who are just listening to this panel discussion, is we need to find sensible, practical solutions help business. So the work of the World Benchmarking Alliance is really, really important. Getting all of those who measure together to confront us with standard requirements or standard platforms where we can report or where we can compare ourselves or where we can compare sectors, as opposed to everyone going into the metrics business, which diverts you from what your core job is. I mean, business is hard enough. It's hard enough in an economy which is going backwards to actually get your business to go forward. If you're now confronted by another set of requirements, reporting requirements, which even exceed those that accountants have burdened us with, and I use the word burden advisedly. Some company annual reports are so long that I'm sure not even the chief executive reads them. I'm trying to keep ours short and crisp, and it's a hell of a hard job. So I think what we need to do here for once, and maybe politically, and that message is for the G20, they're not doing it, and maybe they should listen. We are reaching a phase where actually society understands that we have to trust all parts and we have to accept the bona fides of the others. This is now about practical implementation, not about naming and shaming. Once we implement, we'll naturally name and shame those who stay behind. So I'm actually very encouraged, Paulina, as opposed to discouraged by the behavior, particularly the companies we invest in. People are willing and wanting to do better for society.
Thank you, Henrik. And I have to ask a follow-up question on that. Is you are a CEO, and so you are pivotal in your organization at 91 in embedding the right kind of culture in the organization. How do you do that? How do you change your mindset in a classically kind of opaque, very complex system, which is the financial services system?
No, I think it's a very, very good question. Firstly, the regulator in the US uses this phrase, tone from the top. It's not what you dictate, it's the tone leadership sets. So I think the key job we have in society, if we want to change the business world or improve what our business contributes to a better world, I think the key thing is the responsibility is on boards to make sure the succession is managed so that people who have the right mindset take leadership. Obviously, you are competent enough. I mean, there's no doubt competence is important, but the mindset of looking beyond your short term, and in the end, we are all ultimately, we are not owners. We are just tenants on this earth, and we should leave the earth and society better than we got it. And I think that frame of mind is the most important thing. And what we do in leadership promotion and leadership progression, we do not only look at technical competence, we say, are you getting it? Because in the end, we operate by license from society. If a business abuses that license and doesn't behave responsibly, in the end, society will revoke it, and there's a massive risk in the business. So we in the financial sector not got it right. And I think quite important, I'm very glad to see Sunal, with her measurement, and that her organization doing great work, and so to all of you, but Clara's impact work. But actually in the investment sector, we don't only look at impact. Impact is an important part, but it's a subsector. The big part is in this sort of day-to-day stuff is pricing the externalities, which both economists and the financial sector fail to do because we're so dependent on data. And sometimes you actually have to estimate the externality, the negative one or the positive one, without hard data. Now, you guys are helping us getting some of the data. And I think training our people to apply that judgment, and I can give you a very simple example. If you looked at on typical financial metrics at certain industries which are now very close to going out of business, you would have seen the returns are adequate, they pay great dividends, they have strong balance sheets, they have good management, and you think they're actually, if you look back 20 years, their share prices have underperformed because society has slowly withdrawn capital. The financial sector was very slow to do it. It could have done it much faster, forced faster transitions if we were really more aware of it or had better tools. So one of the things we are doing is to try and work very hard to give our people those tools. So it's leadership mindset, but it's also, in a sense, awareness of what the real task is. And in our case, we really have to price capital properly so that the rest of society can implement. But I want to make one last point, Paulina. Sorry to talk so long, but there's one point I'd like to make. Without ultimate, and I think TCFD is a great example. We know TCFD was a voluntary effort, but we know there's regulation down the track. Without governments actually saying, this is the rule for society, because as business, we actually only react to demand in society. We don't make those rules, and then we make something profitable and supply it efficiently. So in a sense, society has to be clear about its rules. And I think Paris was a great win. And of course, then we had the problems with the US withdrawing. We need to get COP26 right, because once we get that right, business tends to adjust if you tell them what to do. But if you ask them to invent the future beyond the competence of their product area or their technical area, business is probably not, probably going to be at sea and adrift for longer. So I think it's really, really important that the governmental or the regulatory framework is implemented and designed as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Henrik. That's you're leading us to our next theme, which will be about the G20 and what it needs to do. But just before we get there, let me remind everybody who's listening to us and this conversation, do please put your questions and comments in the chat, and that will be shared with us, with the audience. I'm going to take the liberty of being the moderator and continuing along my questioning. I've heard a lot of optimism from everybody, which is really great. We are at the tipping point. Some would say we are making progress. Hendrik, you said that this has been actually that the one demand is sustainability that's been accelerating, but I'm sure there are challenges, right? So Clara and Sonal, there are so many different organizations in standard setting. They are regional, they are national. How do you make any sense of that, really? And is there, Europe is taking forward the non-financial reporting directive and will provide a common approach for companies operating in Europe. What is there a need actually to have something that is globally consistent for multinational organizations that then, for multilateral companies, and that then also I'd like to, after bringing Herbrand in terms of the SDG 2000 that he talked about, that is truly global companies. So what do they need from a kind of this reporting system that we're moving towards? Let me come to you, Clara, first.
Absolutely, Paulina. And I think everyone would agree that if you could have global now, it would be the best because of these footprints, these multinational footprints, and because of the nature of the capital markets and cross-border capital flows. So I think the question is not, is a global solution, the ambition, but rather what is the right path to get there? What is the fastest way to get there? And I think there are some really important initiatives underway to figure that out. What I wanted to comment on, I suppose, is what gives me hope in terms of this breaking through the clutter on the G20 agenda. I think that there's so many things that are going to be competing for attention. But I think it's incredibly important we use the analogy of financial accounting as we make the case for why this moment matters so much for accounting for broader value right now. If you think back to the 1930s and 40s, and even then through the 70s up to the early 2000s, there was a pivotal moment post-Great Crash when everyone agreed we do need to have the ambition of global financial accounting systems. And then it's been a winding road from there. But obviously the IFRS in over 150 jurisdictions has meant we do have truly international standards for financial accounting. And the reconciliation with US GAAP means that you can still as a company list on US stock exchanges with IFRS. So we've figured out how we can have that interoperability. And what's interesting is that it doesn't mean that you can't have these jurisdictional additions that are crucial from local public policy perspectives. So I don't think we should have a fight about regional versus global at all. I think we should look at what happened with financial accounting standards and recognize how this could be done with sustainability accounting, sustainability reporting, and really have that ambition in mind. And the other thing I would just say that is that we can, there's, you know, the adage of what gets measured gets managed is an adage I used to hate, because I would be worried that it suggested that only what gets measured in a quantitative form counts. I've grown to understand over the last decade that much of what gets measured from a sustainability perspective is quantitative, but there's a lot that can be qualitative too. And you can actually have a very rich picture through measurement that deals with nuances. And so I actually now think that adage is as important as ever, because if we don't talk about this, what I think of as like the basic plumbing system of this information, then the aspirations of achieving the SDGs globally are very hard to make practical. Obviously, there are so many other things in the ecosystem that we also need, but this feels just foundational. We can't even talk about whether we know whether we're making progress or not unless we have this plumbing system in place. So I am really hopeful that accounting becomes the new sexy conversation to be having at the G20.
Great, thanks so much, Clara. Can I draw in Sonal? And I know you at SASB have been working with other standard setters actually in trying to get some consistency and alignment of approach. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. As you know, the set of kind of sustainability related frameworks and standard setters have been dubbed the name the alphabet soup. Perhaps I like the word plumbing better, so maybe I'll start using that as the analogy. But in the, most recently, what we have done is SASB, GRI, CDP, CDSB, as well as integrated reporting groups, the IIRC. We've all come together recently to actually put out a joint statement of intent, because we've recognized that the consolidation and cooperation of these frameworks and standards is needed at the international level to build that foundation that a lot of what Hendrik was talking about, a foundation of data and information on which global capital markets and sustainable development goals can really advance. So we really see the opportunity to build kind of what we call a set of building blocks by which information can be provided on the ways that companies have been impacted by these sustainability issues from a financial performance level, and another which is talking about how companies both impact and depend on the resources and activities that really impact people, the planet, and the economy. And all these things form the building blocks of solutions. And then on top of that could be these, kind of both international and regulatory solutions that markets are looking for across the board. So I think at the end of the day, this kind of approach really allows us the opportunity to think about how we can work together to bring about a solution that is critical for global markets, for international solutions, and that can also be helpful for, I think regional organizations, jurisdictions that are looking for the same type of information to help inform decision making, both at the local, regional, and international level.
Thanks so much, Sonal. And that also takes us really nicely onto, or actually one of the questions through the chat box that we've just had. And so having in place a system or metrics that are well understood and implemented will also help avoid what we have previously known as greenwashing, what we're now knowing as SDG washing. And there's a question there from the chat box I'd like to throw open to the panelists. SDGs are often depicted in sustainability reports, which include those of the SDG 2000. However, I'm afraid of the overuse of the SDGs without proper implementation. Examples include quoting affordable and clean energy, but quoted by an oil and gas company as they improve their coal efficiency. Is there any plans for oversight of these sort of cases? So how do we avoid SDG washing? Can I ask for a volunteer before I pick on anyone to address that? Gebran, thank you.
I'm sure Hendrik has something to say about this as well, because I think you come across it a lot if you analyze companies. But that's also the business that we are in as the World Benchmark Alliance. And So we've the term rainbow washing is an elegant term to talk about SDG washing. And I think this really illustrates the early days of the SDGs, where just everyone picked a color that they liked and a project that was already sort of more or less aligned with it, and then went for it and said, charge off to New York to tell what they have contributed to the SDGs. So you had oil and gas companies talking about plastic recycling. You think it's great, but it's not really the point of the conversation that we should be having. We're having data. We have technology companies talking about how they green their data centers, which is great. But if you make a mess of the internet in terms of how we deal with data and how it undermines democracy, then we're not having the right conversation. So I think this is the type of maturing that we have now seen, and it's also the type of discipline that we try to bring with these transformations and linking them to industries. Like it has to be about the core of your business. You know, that's where the value of your business is created, and that's also where the biggest impact of your business is. So that's where the disclosure and of that sort of data should be. And I think we can be optimistic from that perspective, in the sense that is really maturing a lot, and it goes quite quickly. I think so where my concern would be is that is if we look at the sort of the parameters for the world on hunger, on poverty, on climate, on biodiversity loss, they're going into a different direction. So of course we can accept a time lag in this, right? We're changing an oil tanker. Sorry if that's pun not intended, but we're really changing something massive, and it's going to take a lot of time before that actually translates into real world impact. But that shouldn't stop us from making companies really, really curious about how it is actually impacting the societies and the communities in which they operate. And there's a big disconnect still, and it's partly a disconnect that we just have to live with and keep charging on in the right direction. But these two parameters are completely going in a different direction, and that should be something that keeps us all concerned.
Gerbrand, for Paulina, may I
Yes, please.
follow Gerbrand's words? He said I wanted to say something is right. Gerbrand, I fully agree with your framework and the fact that we have to up the game because the indicators go wrong. But I think we mustn't get hung up on greenwashing, or if people put a picture of some SDG in their annual report, that's a hell of a lot better than 30 years ago when they didn't mention it. Okay, so to me, even if it's at the margin, if they start giving a bit away or encourage their people to involve in society, let's not scare them by saying this is terrible. What I would argue for is that, and I'm sort of speaking, we've supported many green bond issues and things like that. I think the idea of separating green finance from other finance is wrong. All finance should encourage the transition, and all companies should. So the idea of calling I'm issuing a green bond is good. I should be able to issue a bond and get a lower interest rate if I am genuinely sustainable, or my company is genuinely sustainable, and the market judges it not to have a big negative externality embedded in its business. If I'm a carbon energy company, or I'm a plantation business in Malaysia, etc., then I need to think, what am I doing to assess? Or if I'm a great industrial company in the sustainability indices of the world and I manufacture plastic, maybe that's the thing that analysts should price and say at some point, or you're in the food industry and you've been poisoning people for decades, that there's a massive legal and other liability coming against you. So therefore price it in. Let's focus on the mainstream. Let the main thing be the attention. And I think the energy going on of beating up on the sort of greenwashing thing is almost a bit like I often see in places in Africa where we invest quite a lot of money, how the NGOs squabble and they drive home in their white Land Cruiser 4x4s, which cost more than what the entire community is earning a year, which they're supposed to help. So that's losing the point. So I think I hear your point, and you guys should discipline and you should measure. But if people are at least expressing intent, let's encourage them and let's bring them back to their main and their core business and say, how are we going to improve it? Also to grow, to create the opportunity for new businesses. I mean, there's a huge new, not only green economy, but an economy based on more sustainable supply chains, etc., busy developing in front of our eyes. We need to back those businesses and encourage them rather than worry too much about those who who are slower because the laws of the land and the regulations should catch them.
Thank
So
you.
I'm less worried about greenwashing.
No, you raised some very good points and a robust business response, which is appreciated on this panel. As I said, we wanted to have an open dialogue with all from a cross-sector perspective. So thank you for that. I want to turn to Seema before we move on to the next theme, which is the role of the G20. Seema, in line with the thinking of how we can encourage business to behave in a responsible manner. Earlier in the conversation, we talked about naming and shaming. In your view, what is the right balance in terms of incentivizing business to do the responsible thing? You talked about examples of companies disclosing on corporate governance, for example, and then where it tips into the now we call out the fact that there is inaction or companies are not going far enough. From your representative perspective, what's your point of view on this?
So actually, frankly, incentives work quite well, I think. At least that's been our experience in India. We have, in the last 20 years, created a lot of large-scale movements by showcasing the benefits and recognizing the role models. I'll give you examples. We run a sustainability award, excellence award for the past 15 years. And it covers all, it covers 240 parameters, whatever you're discussing in terms of ESG, everything covers disclosures. It's a very high bar, right? So many companies fail to reach that bar, but they strive to reach that bar because once they reach there, they know the kind of recognition they will get, right? So over the years, we've had nearly 400 companies and we capture their data. So we also get to know what companies are doing. So I believe movements and mechanisms such as these, which allow companies to get included rather than excluded, are much better than trying to just say, you are bad and so you should be kept in one corner. I think we should be more inclusive. We should mentor them. We should give them opportunities to improve and we should guide them. And of course, there should be strong regulation. So there's a minimum bar that we need to set, right? And that strong regulation should clear out the ones who are really are not ethical about things and are not going to do things the right way, right? But our regulation should be made to only come out with those 5% who are not going to do things, right? 95% that we should target, we believe, are the honest businesses who want to do the good thing. And we should therefore find that enabling frameworks. And I give you an example, and I'm sure there's so many others, where you can incentivize, guide them, show them the way, recognize them. Believe me, showing role models would put so much of, energy in a movement, and they would want to come. We are running a program called CAP 2.0. It's Climate Action Program 2.0, where we are saying that how do you, as companies, show that you're taking action to limit the emissions globally to 2.0, where is your contribution? Believe me, we have so many entries and they want to show it. That spun this movement of people saying, I want to be zero carbon, I want to be carbon neutral. So I think this incentive business, for me at least, I feel it works very well. Yeah, of course, bare minimum regulation and very strong enforcement of that is very important to create at least a minimum level playing field. And beyond that, we want to encourage. That's what I would like to say.
That's wonderful. And you have completely set us up for the next conversation, our next theme, which is the role of regulation or having in place an effective enabling environment. So we've heard a lot about the need for comparable, actionable reporting, disclosures from companies, incentivizing companies, and where is the balance? Where is the tipping point in the naming and shaming as well? And then those are all actions for the many different stakeholders that we've been considering in our conversation. And we started from the point that not one actor can take this far enough. So we all need to work together. So with that, and we're here at the C20, so we're going to be thinking about what we need the G20 to do. So moving on to our second theme, I think I have some questions for the panelists, and I'd like to again give a shout out to the people listening. If you keep your questions coming in, and we'll consider those too. However, first of all, so let me we'll go in the same order. So Clara, I'll come to you first. You talked about accountancy, and that's really where the power you feel might be in the next kind of couple of years in terms of regulatory progress. How do we communicate that need to G20? How do we get them to put this on the top of their agenda when, as we know, you yourself mentioned earlier, this is a very cluttered agenda for politicians, and they're very much focused on fixing what's happened, the fallout from the crisis.
So I want to pick up on some of the really good comments made by the other panelists in answering that, because I do think we should separate transparency from performance. And I think that, to the point Seema was making, you need to encourage when it comes to better performance. But transparency for me is just honesty about positive and negative impacts today, without judgment, just honesty. And it's interesting, if you look at the role of auditors, they don't opine on whether performance is good enough. They just opine on whether performance is fairly represented. And that's the piece that I'm talking about, that I think is crucial to make a big step forward on in terms of the role of policy. And the reason why I think that transparency matters so much is, in terms of policy, is that if you don't have all companies required to do this at the same time, my great fear is that those who do decide to be transparent look bad. It is not a level playing field. And the reality is, even the most fastidious social enterprise, I bet you, has negative impacts as well as positive. It just is the way that the world is in terms of stakeholder management. And obviously, every organization is on a journey to minimize or get rid of the negative and increase the positive within their constraints and capabilities. And I think that it would be a disaster, in my view, if the measurement conversation leads to a groundswell of the market deciding to become more transparent, and then they get cold feet because a lot of the market doesn't at the same time, and they don't feel that they look good relative to others who are hiding things away. So I just think that if you've got policy stepping in, it levels the playing field on this incredibly important conversation.
Thank you. Absolutely.
Can I just, Paulina, agree with Clara? I think it's this is probably the most important line. If we can, you want to have accountants show a balance sheet with assets and liabilities, and a company is quite comfortable to show both, and they know how to measure. But I think the one thing that Clara can help us, or her activity, is just please keep it simple. Accountants have managed to complicate financial reporting to such an extent that, I've been in this industry for 30 years. I don't understand. I would have paid reams of accountants to tell us the rules the whole time, as opposed to keeping it simple. I think on sustainability, we should pick very few big things we measure properly, and let the companies provide the small things as they want, and undoubtedly financial markets reward honesty. They don't reward opaqueness. So I think you don't have to overcook it, but the key metrics that you guys want measured, you've got to design, and we've got to all do it, because otherwise you can't compare. So, but I thought this was a very strong point you made. Sorry for the intervention, but I just wanted to applaud your comment.
Oh, no, I love the fact that it's a conversation, and what you just said resonates very much. And in fact, at the WBA, one of our ambitions is to keep it simple, is to make it simple, purely for that reason, that it gets noticed. So now, thinking about this transparency revolution, clearly there's tons out there. So how do we keep it simple? What is it that's going to allow the G20 to properly set the right policy to take us to level the playing field?
Yeah, I think, in 2015, it was the G20's Financial Stability Board that really established the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. This was a voluntary framework for companies to disclose financial impact on climate-related risks and opportunities. Now, look, they did it because of the concerns in the financial community that the assets are being mispriced because the full extent of climate risk is not being factored in. It's threatening market stability. But what it did was lead to this revolution in transparency, I think, as Hendrik mentioned, that is really being recognized by regulators and policymakers and civil society organizations. At this point, we're at a place where I think this revolution can be broadened to build a comprehensive system of corporate reporting that goes beyond climate, to include diversity, to include inequality, to include the range of environmental, social, governance issues that companies must manage for, build opportunities on. So that is really what we need to do in order to build that base of revolution that we were just talking about. And I think the G20 has the power to play a leading and critical role in accelerating this system change by facilitating cooperation among stakeholders, supporting the development of common language. I think this is ultimately how we're going to need to think about measuring progress on sustainability goals. And this is where G20 can play an important role.
Thank you. And let me just ask a follow-up question on the common language piece. And earlier we talked about the need for education. And so everybody understands, companies understand what are the steps that they can take. Whose language is it? Where do you find where's the interpretation bit? Is it because politicians don't understand business? Is it because business doesn't understand civil society? Or is it geographical? Do you see what I mean? Where's the unblocking that we need to do?
So I think we're going to get all the speakers on this panel to unmute immediately because I'm sure they all want to speak on this. I think we've all dealt with it. I think from the standpoint of standard setters, and I'll really speak to that end. For us, it's about having a globally agreed upon set of sustainability topics and metrics, right? That can be applied to any company, anywhere, no matter their size. And really by then what happens is that when you have that common layer of topics and metrics, what you do is, number one, you get more comparable, consistent, reliable data, which Hendrik needs, for his analysis. And then you also move closer to establishing global sustainability disclosures that meet the need of capital markets and that work towards kind of this global level playing field to really help both companies and investors improve their decision making on the SDGs, on any activities that would move forward them to support enterprise value, enterprise value creation and sustainable development.
Let me open that question to others on the panel if they would like to address that before we move on. Clara.
Paulina, I will just jump in with it. I think the connectivity between languages is as important as trying to figure out words we can all use and understand to mean the same thing. So even listening to Hendrik talk about pricing externalities, Hendrik, when you said that, I couldn't have agreed more. And yet my mind went immediately to the sort of calculation from something changes in the world, a natural resource or a person experiences something, that leads to an impact on them. The impact then creates a dependency for the company, which can manifest as a risk or an opportunity. And that risk or opportunity can then be priced. And that can happen at the company level, it can happen at the system level. So sometimes these things, which are small impacts for individual companies, add up to a macro risk that then comes back to bite the individual company. And all of that I've just described, and I've oversimplified it enormously, but that is value change, it's systems thinking. And actually the language that I've just used there, different parts of that chain will resonate for different audiences because they are battling away at one particular part of it. And I think we just all have to look at the piece we're working on in that context of the system to better talk to each other about why the different parts matter.
That's a great example. And I'd like to go one step further actually, and thinking about we're at the C20. Gerbrand, a question to you. Are we hearing and understanding those people who are at most risk of being left behind? by the global movements and by the use of global language, whether it's politicians or businesses taking this agenda forward. We know we work a lot with impacted communities and try to understand what they need from the SDG agenda. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Well, I think one of the fundamental problems is that that standards and norms are set by those with the biggest influence, and that is always the case. And they're not set by those impacted the most. I mean, I don't want to be naive about this. There's nothing we can do about that, but there is a responsibility for those that are in a position to set standards or to hold others to account, to be sensible of what this actually translates into impact for who. Right, so smallholder farmers will never be at our tables to set the standards for soil fertility or for water use. That is just not going to happen. But it means that for all of the other players that are in a position of influence, that they have to be mindful and have to understand where this is ultimately about. And we will never fully get it right. But there is a lot of things that we can do to make sure that we get closer. That those with influence are in their sensing and in what they do and prescribe are close to those that are impacted.
Thank you. And that power is, much of it does sit with the G20 community. We know that. SEMA, India takes over the presidency of the G20 in 2022, and I presume, like all other presidencies, I know it's already doing some preparation work in thinking about the where it needs to go. What role do you think the business community in India, but then other stakeholders in India play in providing that voice to the government to set the agenda at the global level? Can you describe the kind of the actions that the CII might already be thinking about in terms of making you relevant to the G20?
Yes, I mean, like in every process, and in this process of the run up to the G20 also, CI of course is very closely involved with the B20, as you know, because we are a business-led organization. So a lot of our inputs go into the B20 preparatory work that is happening, and we are very actively contributing to areas of climate, resource efficiency, gender equality, because those are some of the areas that the Indian government has also actually put quite high on the agenda. So resource efficiency, climate connect is one thing that we are very, very closely working with the government here, trying to show that if, because, as we build back better, which is and as we bring back the economy on track in many countries, including in our country, there's a huge sense of, trying to make our industry more competitive if we have to be in the global value chain. And efficiency is important for competitiveness. And we are linking, therefore, resource efficiency to competitiveness and also to the climate goals. We are saying that if Indian government, through policy directions, etc., by encouraging, by putting penalties if you're not, efficient in your resource efficiency criteria, if you can create a movement around this, there'll be a lot of climate gains. And this is one thing that we are working, and in fact, we are looking at deep dives into sectors and working with the government to provide this information so that they can take up a strong agenda on it. So this remains front and center. The other is the social aspect. As you know, in India, social dimension is very, very important, and you very clearly mentioned, very good point that, in the whole aspect of standard setting, etc., and when we are prescribing frameworks and metrics, how do we bring in the voice of people who are actually, whose lives we want to change, right? This whole thing is about how do we change the lives of people through the whole SDG movement is around that. And I think there also, as CII, we have been, working a lot with the communities and feeding this back into the policy. So the way that we do is we are the bridge between what we see on the ground, and our action on the ground is also led by industry. So as you know, in India, there's this, CSR requirement, the corporate social responsibility requirement, which has, every company has to spend about 2% of their profits, average of last 3 years, into community work. So what we do with our membership, which is around 9,500, we take on large scale, high impact programs at the community level, where quite a few of them pool in their resources. And we do the work with them, with their partner organizations. I mean, one example is this entire air pollution and crop residue burning. Right now, as we speak, CI is working in over 200 villages with our companies' support, and we are helping farmers to not burn. But that's one point of it. But what we do is we take the learnings out. We take the learnings out that how do you shift agriculture to becoming climate smart, becoming more resilient, and feed that into the policy so that we can do better for the community. And this is where I think these pieces, from the micro to the macro, is what we have to bring into the G20 agenda also. And we want to work with the government to say, how do you link the micro agenda to the macro agenda? Because that's very, very important. Finally, you have to have the impact on the micro level. So these are some of the examples, but a long road ahead. Already this conversation has thrown up a lot of ideas how we should be working with our different parts of the government. So very useful to have this conversation. Thank you. And that's my comment on your question.
Thank you so much, Seema. It's wonderful to hear you describe it from the micro to the macro and then back to the micro. It's absolutely, it's so critical. We talk about it as hearing the talking to the most impacted, or the addressing the leaving no one behind agenda, or making the invisible visible. And I think that is a call to action for all of us, is to make sure that the G20 preparations and then the agendas account for that. And that's why when we started this conversation, we wanted to bring those different voices together, because that's the only way that we're going to get through this. So we have about 15 minutes left. Hendrik, I'd like to bring you back into the conversation and thinking about, from your perspective, from working in capital markets, which have been short-term, led by short-term decision-making, but we're on a move towards thinking about a more longer-term agendas, but also then bringing in the policy side, in that you can't change that on your own, and you need policy to help achieve that long-term agenda. What do you need from governments to be able to effectively allocate capital towards those with the biggest needs on a more longer-term basis?
Thank you, Paulina. I think the long and short-term thing is a societal, and it rests on the fact that society has trust in its own long-term. If you look at the way a place like Japan, which is a fairly coherent society, functions, it's not constantly at war with itself, and therefore it actually addresses some of its long-term needs. Compare that to, I think, in some Western societies where we've overemphasized competitive democracy to a point of destruction. So the long short-term thing, I think, is a societal thing, is a societal contract, it's a social contract thing, which has very little to do with what an individual business could do. But I think as a representative of an individual business or as an investor, I'm very aware of the limitations of the G20, which in itself is a very wide, broad church, very broad coalition. I'd like the G20 leaders to do only one thing. They can do other politics and press releases, etc., but one thing, and that is get some consensus on the climate emergency. Because actually, if we look at the world that we've lived in, messy as it is, and potentially environmentally destructive as it is, the last 30, 40 years, we've improved the existence of humanity immeasurably. The reason why we get political noise today is because in the Western democracies, people had a very cushy life, and they now invited the developing world to compete on their terms, that the developing world, i.e. emerging markets, have started winning, and it became painful back home where you lost jobs. That's actually not a global issue. That is a developed market democracy issue. So we should look at the global issue. The global issue, the world at large, has dealt with many of the the material needs of people in the world. It hasn't done it on a sustainable way. We've got to get it sustainable. What is the biggest sustainability contribution we can make now is make sure we stop destroying the planet by emitting too much carbon. So let's just get a decarbonization commitment. In other words, revive Paris. Whoever is the US president must know he stands alone, and the rest of the globe is willing to commit to zero emissions. And I think then even the US government will flinch. To me, if we must get it now and let's turn TCFD into regulation or into not a voluntary organization, and we then have a chance to debate the other issues. Otherwise, we will fry while debating the other issues. So one single upward. Let's get a climate, let's resurrect Paris in some way, and let's get serious about it, because all our people are suffering, especially in the emerging markets with droughts and pollution of oceans and warming of oceans, etc. That's it.
Thank you. That's a strong call to action. And actually, I was noted. I had a round. We're going to come to a round robin in a minute, and I was going to ask you for your call to action to the G20. So this is notice for everyone else to be thinking of your calls.
Give you our own call of action when you ask us later.
Okay, great. That's a challenge. We're going to hear from Gerbrand as well before we wrap up. He's going to provide a summary or some concluding remarks. I hesitate to say summary because it's always quite difficult to wrap up, provide a summation of such a rich conversation. But we'll come to him. I think I'd like to move to the round robins actually, because Hendrik has set us up really nicely for thinking about the one action that we could ask the G20 to do. While you have a think of that, I'd like to highlight a few of the C20 calls to action, which have been submitted to the G20, and I'm really pleased to say that many of them echo our discussion here today. And it's not a surprise, I guess, because there's the challenges that we're talking about, the opportunities that we're talking about are felt through every bit of society and all different stakeholders. So, and I think that is the trick that us as stakeholders contributing to the G20 agenda, that's the trick we need to pull off, is how do we all contribute from the same perspective, so that then we have a clear set of deliverables for governments and others. So while you have a think, these are the three that I'm going to highlight. The G20 must uphold principles of accountability and transparency. The G20 should pursue existing agendas like the Paris Agreement, the SDGs, and not use COVID as an excuse for inaction. And then the G20 should bridge the financing gap for the SDG decade of action. So they all resonate, but I think in reading around the subject a little bit, I do think they are, in terms of bridging the financing gap, it talks a lot about public financing, upholding principles of accountability and transparency. It's really related to, again, what public authorities and governments are doing to act in that manner. And pursuing the existing Paris Agreement, the SDGs. Again, it's reflecting on what the governments need to do to pursue that agenda, rather than all stakeholders that need to pursue the agenda. So my addition would be that the private sector has a critical role to play in all of those calls to action, and identifying what that is, what those steps are for the private sector would be really helpful to do in parallel as the G20 focuses on those. So I hope that gave you enough time to think of your call to action. I'm going to get to my round robin. I'm going to go in the same order as before. So Clara, if I can come to you first, please.
Absolutely. Well, it won't surprise you I'm going to say this, given my previous remarks, but I do think this next year running up to COP is the year for governments to take a regulatory stance on transparency of information about companies' performance. And I think back to what I was discussing earlier about the two theories of change, I'm not naive. Different jurisdictions are going to move on those two theories of change in different ways. Some may only move on the resilient capital market theory of change and require that disclosure that is the subset of information, as it were, about impacts on the world that is relevant to pricing externalities for capital markets. Other jurisdictions may move on both and equally use regulation to force transparency around all impacts that companies have. I think that's okay if we look at it that way. This building block idea and recognizing different jurisdictions being in different places is okay. But what we want is jurisdictions to make a move with regulation to really help that transparency bar become tangible and real. And I think the G20 that is absolutely the place for that to come from. And I sincerely hope that's on the agenda.
Thank you, Clara. Let me turn to you, Sonal.
Well, building on that, I think that, and this is, conversations I've had with Emil at World Benchmarking Alliance a lot, which is that, there's a cycle of influence when it comes to transparency, because once you have transparency and standards, you have comparable information. That information can really help inform companies about peer-to-peer benchmark performance and help companies realize that they need to stretch their targets and their goals. That then, helps investors allocate capital towards those companies that lead the industry on these issues. You have data that can inform benchmarks, create the feedback loop to measure and build the evidence of corporate performance and impact. So this beautiful cycle of influence really is what allows us to continue to have improvements over time. Not surprisingly, what I'm going to say is talking about the fact that there needs to be, and especially as we're moving towards regulations on consistent reporting, consistent transparency, there has to be a foundation of a comprehensive system of corporate reporting, which really helps to build those building blocks for different jurisdictions, regulations, et cetera. And really, that's what's going to help us enable to achieve our societal goals to build back better.
Thank you so much for that contribution. Seema, let me come to you, please.
So of course, I echo what and endorse what my co-panelists have said, because I think those are really good suggestions. I have a little different take, and I think my call to action or request to the G20 is to look at the interconnectedness of issues. I think we should not just look at things in silos, which is what causes more problem than actually solving problems. I don't know how they can do it, so I don't mean to say there is a solution to it, but I think it's very, very important as G20, this understanding. And COVID is an example, right? Even when you started, our panelists mentioned that it started as a health crisis and then economic crisis, but was a much larger humanitarian crisis. But had we seen the interconnectedness, maybe we could have caused less distress to many communities. So I think this whole lens of interconnectedness needs to get embedded in everything, every policy, every action, every call to action that we give to the G20. Please look at the interconnectedness is what I would like to say. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And a really great reminder for all of us. Hendrik, do we get another one from you?
Yes, this is our own as a business. Besides, of course, supporting all the calls before, and particularly the interconnectedness awareness. This whole story, we all keep writing about deglobalization. Come on, we're a global community. Yes, we can respect the differences, but that's not something specific to 91. Specific to 91 is that we want to be supportive and constructive owners of companies on behalf of our clients. And we want to focus their minds on the one big challenge, which is the impact of carbon emissions on climate. And we want to ask them to not only measure honestly, but also tell us how they can conduct their businesses in a better way. And particularly put our research muscle to work, or our research abilities to work, not to do this sort of quick and easy thing and say, well, let's all go batteries. Well, we can't all go batteries. It's not practical. Let's look at practical transitions and then support businesses who may get pressure from all sorts of outside groups who don't quite understand the context and help them articulate the context. So it's about supportive ownership in what is probably the most challenging transition that many generations of human beings have had to face and play a small role in that.
Excellent. And if I heard right, that wasn't just a call to action, that was also a commitment. So thank you very much. Gerbrand, it's my pleasure to come to you for the last 5 minutes for your final remarks.
Thank you, Paulina, and thank you to my fellow panelists. I don't think I'll need 5 minutes, but to take us back to the beginning of our conversation, which was a bit like a bit of the revival of the bean counters, and celebrating the need for measurement, but I think also a call to action to bean counters to come together and to keep it simple, so that people like Hendrik and other CEOs can still understand it. But it's also, I think, really important that we keep measuring the things that are create the most impact. And I think it's been outlined by this panel quite well. Climate change, biodiversity, and inequality. Those are the 3 things that we need to focus on, and the 3 things that we need to see reflected in our measurement. And quite often we will have to operate in a space where there is no data. So the fact that there is no data can never be a substitute for saying, well, we can't use our common sense. So this is one of, I think this is sort of my call, that it will take time for this community and for the world to figure out how we measure these things best. But that's not a reason for anyone not to act. There is we have still common sense, and we still know most of us can still tell right from wrong. There is a clear need, and I think it's also been articulated by this panel, for regulators to keep up on this agenda and keep up with the momentum that we've seen in other parts of society, in finance, in business, and to a large extent in civil society. And it will be up to entities like the EU, China, and India that seek to lead on many of these areas. And as it always is a challenge with leading, is that you can't just charge off on your own. And I say this as a European on a panel. I really encourage the European Commission to keep on going with this regulation, to keep pushing the bar, but it only helps and it only makes sense if it brings others along with it. We all know how difficult that is in the current geopolitical climate, but this has to remain the ambition, that if we raise the bar, that we do it for everyone else. There is no point in a decarbonized European Commission if the rest of the world doesn't. And the same is true for biodiversity and inequality and all the other agendas that we are. These are, in the end of the day, these are not national agendas, these are global agendas, and it is a task, and it's a real task because it's difficult for those nations that seek to lead on some of these areas to bring others along with them. That's true for nations, but it's also true for us as individuals working on organizations. None of the organizations represented in this panel and way beyond that can do it on their own. So there's really a need that we all have to, also sometimes the discipline to keep coming together and keep finding that common language that can help us move forward. From my personal point of view, I would like to thank you all very much for your perspectives and your insights. I've learned a lot again. I am really, maybe take as a sort of a last reminder, Hendrik, you may remember that 3 years ago we did a roundtable in Cape Town in the lead up to the World Benchmark Alliance. And honestly, I wouldn't have dreamt we got this far, but more importantly, it's also the level of the conversation and the level of and the amounts of debates we don't have anymore. I think that's a good sort of bar to assess how far we've come, to see that we have every reason to be optimistic and every reason to keep fighting for what needs to be done. I thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you. I just wanted to echo that and thank you, the C20 Summit, for giving us the opportunity to have this really interesting, insightful, robust conversation. And we hope that it's been a contribution to the summit itself. So I think we can wrap up the panel. And thank you to all my panelists for today.
Thank you, Paulina.
So much.
Bye-bye. Nice to meet all of you.
Take care.